Paul important? I mean, really, is he? Certainly to the religious he is, but is any of that really worth considering rationally? Because the religious, no matter how much they play make-believe, they really aren't rational, are they? They might pretend and play the part, but they ignore the bigger questions that really need to be asked. I don't do that, not for a second. And that's why they don't fare very well. I had someone recommend that I look at Mike Licona, who is Associate Professor in Theology at Houston Baptist University and the director of Risen Jesus Incorporated, whatever the hell that is. And he's not one of the ranting lunatic theists that we look at around here so often, so at least he's got that going for him. This time, he wants to explain why Paul is so important, but I have some questions in that regard. Is Paul actually important? Did Paul actually exist? How much faith are we willing to grant here while ignoring the nagging questions? Yeah, let's go find out.
Let me give you 4 reasons why I think Paul is really important.
Okay, why don't you go do that? Now, there are some questions that go along with that, of course, so I'll get those out of the way. Important in what way? He may or may not answer that one as we go on, but I want to point out that we can't even prove that Paul ever existed. We know that Paul was never an eyewitness to anything having to do with Jesus, and therefore anything Paul or whoever wrote the things attributed to Paul on the subject, that's largely irrelevant. And this is where a lot of theists pretend that if it appears in the Bible, it has to be true. And that's not necessarily the case. Faith doesn't matter. Just because someone wrote down some claims that ultimately appeared in a book of mythology, that doesn't actually mean anything. Just keep that in mind as we move forward.
Number 1, he claimed to have been an eyewitness of the risen Jesus.
Yeah, no. He had a drug trip on the road to Damascus. There's a difference. Anyone can claim anything they'd like. I can claim that I flapped my arms and flew around the city and 10 million people saw me. That doesn't make it true. The only thing that would make that claim believable is if a significant portion of those people corroborated my account, and especially, at least these days, if some enterprising people got it on video. Then you'd have more of a basis for believing that it ever happened. But what do we have for Paul's claims? Nothing. Nothing at all. Someone simply wrote it down, and no one else ever came forward in a written account to agree that it ever happened. What do we have? A story. Absolutely nothing more.
He didn't say he saw Jesus' resurrection, but he did say that he saw the risen Jesus. And so he mentions this in a couple different texts. So he claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. And these come from his undisputed letters.
Well, they're someone's undisputed letters. That doesn't mean that they're his. And this is a point that a lot of theists don't seem to understand. I get a lot of pushback on this point. All we have are letters purporting to be from someone who used to harass Christians, suddenly becoming one of the faithful. But how do we know that's actually the case? We have no independent reports of a Christian hunter suddenly going rogue and joining the opposition. All we have are claims with no corroboration whatsoever. And that's an important distinction when we look at their validity. Because it's not at all unlikely that someone or a group of someones might provide their mythological character a background unlikely to convert to Christianity, instead of just writing about some schlub who joined their cult. It was that guy who was hunting their cult members down who got converted. So we have to be really careful when we look at these accounts and try to take them seriously without any of it being independently verifiable. Just because you want it to be true, that doesn't mean that it's true.
Second, he was not one of Jesus' disciples at the time. He was hostile. In fact, he was out persecuting the church.
Well, that's the story. Now, how do we know that the story is true? It's like taking the elements that J.K. Rowling wrote into the Harry Potter stories and proclaiming that all of that actually happened. Well, says who? We don't know. Yet the religious leap to that conclusion because it appears in their big book of multiple choice, and therefore every word must be factually correct. And I'm sorry, but that just doesn't fly. You've got to actually prove it, and they simply cannot.
He believed Jesus was a failed prophet, a false Messiah, and he believed it was God's will to destroy this movement because it was just a bad part, a sect of Judaism that had gone astray.
Yet, for all of that, he sure changed his tune pretty quick, didn't he? A couple of days blinded on the road, and he's suddenly singing a completely different tune. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying it couldn't have happened. People have certainly changed their minds dramatically for less. But that doesn't mean, even if any of this ever happened at all, that he was correct in his conversion. He started with a religious belief, an unjustifiable religious belief, mind you, and then changed to another religious belief. That happens all the time. People leave Christianity for Islam or Buddhism or Scientology or whatever. But the Christians never consider that conversion to be valid, do they? But when Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or whatever else come and join the Christian cult, well, the Christians are overjoyed that people made the right decision. While the Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and yada yada yada, they all think that they were led astray. So this is not something that can just be assumed without any kind of proof. If it ever happened at all, which they haven't proved, they've got a whole lot more work to do.
And so he was out to persecute the church. And it was at that time that he claims to have had an experience that he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him.
And at least Mike is honest enough to admit that this is all just interpretation. It could be a complete fabrication by non-Pauline authors who were just trying to tell a convincing story that could be used in apologetic endeavors to gather more sheep. But you still don't have a good reason to think that any of it is true. There is no skepticism going into the religious evaluation of these stories. It's got to be true because it makes them feel good. Now, granted, Paul actually does name himself in at least some of his epistles, although we've now found that some that were attributed to him simply couldn't have been written by the same person as others. This is really a problem with the church making up identifications that can't be objectively demonstrated to be so, like the Gospels, like books attributed to Moses in the Old Testament, things like that. Because in those cases, we don't know. We just don't. All the faith in the world doesn't change reality, no matter how much the religious might wish that it did. And we need to keep that in mind because that actually matters.
Third, what he reports is quite early, within 15 to 27 years of Jesus' crucifixion. And I get that from saying, as most scholars would say, Jesus was crucified in either April of 30 or April of 33.
Which scholars exactly? Because I really have a problem with apologists, people who believe stories for religious or emotional reasons, being called scholars in any real sense. Yes, they've studied the Bible. Do we call people who obsessively read the Harry Potter books scholars? I certainly wouldn't, because really, where is the scholarship if you have to take this stuff on faith? Or if you're not, then how is this any different than looking at Arthurian legend? It's just a story until corroboratory evidence can be provided, and absolutely none has been.
And then I'm giving dates here on where most scholars think a number of these letters of Paul's, to which I would appeal, when they were written. And so we're looking at somewhere between 15 and 27 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Paul's writing these letters, which is relatively early.
But that still doesn't make it true. You have to remember that the religious have an agenda that they are trying to push. This isn't scholarship. This is apologetics. They have a narrative that is emotionally comforting to them. So they're trying to construct a scaffolding that supports their narrative without caring if any of it is actually true. That's really the difference, I think, between apologetics and scholarship. One requires that they get to a certain specific conclusion because it makes them happy, and they have been known to play with the data and cherry pick information because it gets them where they want to go. The other side, they only care if they get to the truth. They have no emotional investment to any given interpretation. They just want to get to the facts. They don't really care what the facts happen to be in the end. And this is something that I've pointed out before, but if you look at a lot of the things that Paul supposedly wrote, he wasn't restating Jesus. He is pushing a completely different Pauline agenda. More likely, this is a similar religious offshoot, of which there were many at the time, which was then adapted by early Christians because it could be molded to their perspective. Paul's religion and that of Jesus, they were not one and the same.
And then fourth, Paul was on message with what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching.
And how do you know that? I mean, honestly, how do you know what anyone was preaching in Jerusalem at that time? Where is your corroboratory evidence for any of this? Because I'm not aware of any transcripts of the speeches that were given in the middle of Jerusalem after the death of Jesus. You don't know. You assume. That's all that any of this is. Assumption. It's all every bit of this video has been so far. Assumption. It's why starting with a conclusion that you must reach for emotional reasons is so intellectually damaging. It forces you to make assumptions, unwarranted and unjustified assumptions, because you've got somewhere you've got to be, even if you have no rational reason to be there.
We know that Paul knew several of the apostles, those he calls the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John.
We know nothing of the sort. We know that there was a claim made in that regard, but we don't know if any of those claims were actually so. I could write a book saying I knew Elvis Presley. I didn't, but in 1,000 years, who would ever know the difference? These are things that actually matter, and this is why being skeptical of all claims is important. And you notice that he's treating the Bible as though it's automatically true without ever stopping to recognize that he hasn't proven that it is. Because, as with all other theists, he doesn't care. It's a foregone conclusion based on his blind faith. Just like if someone had blind faith in Harry Potter, the existence of Voldemort would be a foregone conclusion. It's wrong, but that doesn't seem to matter to the blindly faithful.
And he had met with them. He, according to Galatians 1, he went up to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. He spent 15 years with Peter. 14 years later, he meets with Peter, James, and John, runs the gospel message past them. He said that he'd been preaching to ensure he was preaching the same thing they're preaching. And he says they certified that what he was preaching was true.
According to him, at least. We don't have it from them. You just have to trust that whoever is writing this is telling the truth. And why would we do that? It's a claim in a story, nothing more. The truth of the claim is as reliable as it is independently verifiable, which in this case means not at all. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen, nor am I saying that it did. I have no way to know that at this point, and I have no horse whatsoever in this race. I'm just pointing out that Mike here is making assumptions that he cannot back up rationally. And that's an important point that we need to take away from all of this. None of this is rational. It's all completely emotional.
Now imagine this meeting. You got Peter, James, and John and Paul talking history and theology. The Fab Four. I mean, even Bart Ehrman, a friend of mine, has said, I would have liked to have been there with Peter, James, John, and Paul. I mean, who wouldn't? You know, those of us who are interested in these topics, can you imagine sitting there and listening to their conversations?
Assuming they ever took place, sure. But that doesn't mean that what they might have talked about, whatever that might have been, was actually true. Now, I have no vested interest in it one way or the other, but Mike does. He has to believe in it or his religious faith suffers. I don't because I have no faith. They could have talked about invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies, and it wouldn't have made a difference. Just because it came from their mouths, and this goes for absolutely everyone, even me, that doesn't make it true. Truth is only validated by external corroboratory evidence. And there is none for any of this. None at all.
It would have been awesome. But Paul says they certified that what he was preaching is what they were preaching.
Again, according to the author of Paul, whoever the hell that was, they could have said, hell no, you're preaching crap, and it wouldn't have mattered. History is written by the victors, remember? We only get to hear the perspective of one side with no way to verify that that perspective is actually correct. How do we really know if Paul got the blessing of the others? How do we really know if these supposed meetings ever actually took place? We have to take Paul's word for it, and why would we do that? And you might think I'm being needlessly skeptical, and maybe I am. But I'm just poking holes in the religious narrative and showing that they're taking these things on faith when the facts simply do not support their beliefs. They do it because they have to. They have to rely on the Bible because they have nothing else. I'm just showing that the Bible isn't demonstrable or verifiably true. It's a story constructed by the church, which had, and continues to have to this day, a vested interest in maintaining power and control. Keep in mind who put these councils together. It was the church and the ruling classes in Europe who relied on claims of godly authority to maintain their power. Funny how that works, and funny how people still fall for it to this day. Because the arguments aren't getting any better. They aren't being any better defended. It's all feelings and blind faith, and that will never change. Because it can't. Because there is nothing else. It doesn't matter how much you believe these things for emotional reasons. If they aren't actually so, then you've just wasted your time believing them. And that's something the religious will never admit to. It's why they ignore the facts. Because the facts don't get them where they need to go. And that is really, really sad.
Boom, 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 boom.